On this episode of Tom Talks, we have the privilege and great honour to feature this very special 1953 Jaguar C-type. This particular car is the only surviving works Le Mans winning Jaguar. It was the first car to average over 100 miles an hour at the grueling Le Mans 24 hours, and in doing so covered more than 2,500 miles in the process. Because of its revolutionary disc brakes, it changed car production forever and indirectly saved millions of lives. And it's regarded by many as the most important and significant surviving British car. I've thought long and hard about that statement, and today probably some of the McLaren F1 variants may well be worth more money, whether it be the Le Mans winner or one of the F1 LMs. However, because of the history of this particular car, because of the originality, I actually fully support the statement that this particular car has to be the most important surviving British car. Where do we start? I think we should probably start talking about Le Mans 24 hours. So this grueling race first started in 1923, and in the pre-war era it was dominated by the likes of Bugatti, Bentley and Alfa Romeo. And then there was a 10-year gap for World War II, and the first race back was in 1949, which Ferrari famously won Luigi Cignetti in the 166 Barchetta. And then in 1950, there were 3 privately entered Jaguar XK120s, and the best results of those cars was a 12th and 15th place finish. And that opened Jaguar's eyes with the possibilities, the business opportunities that success at Le Mans would bring. And they immediately commissioned the C-type project, which was known as the XK120C. There were 3 cars to be built for the 1951 race, and these cars were known as the XK120C, which was a very clever marketing tool from Jaguar. They wanted the public to see a car that had a very similar resemblance, compete and hopefully be successful on a Sunday, and then the public could walk into the Jaguar showroom on a Monday and buy an XK120, which they saw compete the day before. It was the classic win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Although the C-type very much resembled the XK120 from the exterior, under the skin they were very different animals. The great Colin Chapman has been credited over the years with his monocoque design chassis on his Formula One cars. However, in 1951, Jaguar came up with their space frame chassis and the semi-monocoque aluminium body on the C-type. And this was way before Colin Chapman even thought about it on his Formula One cars. So that gives you an idea of how advanced the C-type was in its day. That brings me on to the period, and this is something that you really have to give consideration to when we talk about cars from this era. That World War II had only just finished, and mechanical engineering was progressing at such a fast rate of knots, and that's because all of the great engineers, technicians, designers that had honed their skills in that terrible war, once the war had finished, they basically translated those skills and put them into either the aviation or the automotive industry. And the Jaguar C-type was a car that very much absolutely benefited from that skill set. So Jaguar go to Le Mans in 1951 and they get incredible success. They win outright. They have great success with their production cars throughout 1951 and early into 1952, And then they go back to Le Mans in 1952. And I think they could definitely be classed as guilty for being a little tipsy, still drunk from their success in 1951. And at a very late stage of preparation for the race, their star driver, Sterling Moss, he decides and demands from Jaguar that he wants a higher end top speed. So Jaguar decided to build 3 new low drag bodies on the cars that they sent to Le Mans in 52. Now those cars didn't resemble anything like the 1951 car nor the 1953 car, and it was an absolute disaster for Jaguar. None of the cars finished, all due to overheating and all due to the redesigned body and the modified cooling systems. William Lyons was so upset, he was distraught. He felt like he let the country down. Patriotism, was still running extremely high, being not long after the war had finished. And I'm sure if you think back and you were a British supporter, whether you were, even if you were Bentley or Aston Martin, you probably wanted the Jaguar team to win over the likes of Mercedes-Benz or even Ferrari. And William Lyons, being as upset as he was, those 1952 cars, which were the cars that were actually used in the 1951 race, as soon as they came back to Coventry, he demanded that they were all broken up and they were all destroyed, because he never wanted to be reminded of the disaster that was the 1952 at Le Mans. He then immediately called all of these engineers, designers, technicians in, and everybody was hurting, everybody was sore from the result. And he said, we need to prepare for 1953. So for 1953, they designed 3 very lightweight Jaguar C-types. Now these cars, this being chassis 51, the cars that were built were chassis 51, chassis 52, and chassis 53. And these cars, although they may have looked similar to the production C-type, they were so different. William Lyons demanded that every single element of the car was addressed. The advancements of aviation was called upon to say, what can we do to make this car lighter, quicker, and more reliable? And the result of that was this. Where do we start with the differences? Now, the list of the differences on these cars, on these 3 lightweights, I was guilty of being ignorant to the fact. So being in the car industry all my life, I knew that these 3 cars were all, they were the lightweight cars, but lightweight, sometimes, a Porsche 2.7 RS lightweight to a touring, there isn't really that much difference. The lightweight Jaguar C-types, those 3 works cars, the production cars, it's incredible, the list of differences. So where do we start from? The steel chassis tubes, the wall on those tubes were half the thickness. So they looked identical from the outside, but if you cut one open, the wall of the chassis tube was half the thickness of the production cars. The body was made out of 22 gauge aluminium. 22 gauge aluminium is basically paper thin, so push it and you're going to dent the car. There was so much stuff that was taken from the aviation world. New cylinder head was designed, the radiator was changed, the oil cooler, the water cooler, the fuel pipes, even things like the screens, the aero screens were made out of perspex compared to glass. The actual bracket that held the aero screen in place. On the production cars, it was a thick brass bracket, where on the lightweight cars, it was basically a folded aluminium bracket. Everything was made lighter. But by far the most innovative difference between the lightweight cars and the production cars was the introduction of the new disc brakes. Now, disc brakes had been around for a few years earlier in the aviation world, but never in car production. disc brakes basically created weight saving and were way more efficient than the old archaic drum brake design. And driving down that Mulsanne straight at 150 miles an hour, you wanted to be able to brake later, and then later in the race you wanted your brakes to have better performance, and that's what the Jaguars had. And that's why the Jaguars in 1953 basically demolished the field. They came first, second, and a fourth place finish out the 3 cars that were entered in the 53 race. Now, because of the change of the brake design, they had to change the wheel design, the spokes were changed, they went from 54 spokes to 60 spokes. Also, the 1953 cars, to give you an idea of the power difference, they went from something like 205 brake horsepower for a production car to 250 brake horsepower for one of these lightweight cars, and the cars were much lighter. So outwardly, when you look at this car and you park a normal production C-type next to it, you would easily be guilty for thinking they were very similar cars. But I don't think I've known any car, there's no Ferrari lightweight 250 short wheelbase that has as many differences compared to the normal production car as what these C-types do. They're just incredibly different animals, and all of those upgrades, those innovative designs for the 1953 car basically went into the D-type for the D-type production the following year. So we've touched on Le Mans, we've touched on C-type production, and we've spoken about the difference between, just some of the differences between the lightweight cars, those 3 special works cars, and the production cars. Now it's time to actually talk about this particular chassis, which is incredible. This is the car that actually won Le Mans in 1953. It was driven by Duncan Hamilton and Tony Rolt. Duncan Hamilton was a car dealer. You know, back in those days, not everybody was pro racing drivers. The field wasn't full of Stirling Moss and Fangios. And Tony Rolt was an engineer. So this was very much their hobby. They were very competitive individuals, and 2 drivers had to share this drive in 1953 for the full 24 hours. Very impressive indeed. The car would obviously go on to win the race, as we've touched upon. It averaged over 100 miles an hour, covered more than 2,500 miles in that race. And then following the success at Le Mans, the 3 lightweight cars were all sold to Ecurie Cos, the Scottish national racing team. And they continued to campaign all 3 cars for the next couple of years. And then in 1955, the car was then sold to a gentleman called Bill Smith. And Bill Smith had the factory repaint the car red. And whilst in his ownership, he also acquired a new uprated D-type head from the factory, which was fitted to the car. And he also acquired, due to a small accident he had in a race in 1955, a new spare C-type bonnet, which is still fitted to the car today, but we will come back to that a little bit later. Then in 1956, the car was sold to a gentleman called Geoffrey Allison, and he had the factory repaint the car white. So the car started green, it then went to red with Bill Smith, and then it went to white. And interestingly today, if you have a look underneath the air intake onto the bonnet, you can still see evidence, which we decided to leave in the car's refurbishment in 2020 and 2021, evidence of the 3 different colours of paintwork, the green, the white and the red. Then in 1957, the car was sold to a gentleman in the United States of America, a gentleman named Miles Brubaker. Now Miles took this incredibly successful race car and decided to use it as a road car daily. And he would continue to do so until he got married. And then when he got married, he decided to fully restore the car. So he removed the original body and he started on the chassis. And he managed to finish the restoration of the chassis, but never got around to finishing the restoration of the body. All he done was actually strip the paint. And then he put the original body in the roof of his garage, and the chassis and body would remain untouched until 1968, at which time the car, the chassis, the original body, and all of its components was sold to the great and legendary Briggs Cunningham. And Briggs Cunningham would display the rolling chassis in his museum for the next 18 years. This is probably the reason why the car is such a great survivor today, because through that period, through the 70s, these old race cars of the 50s and the early 60s, they were all really messed around with. Sometimes Corvette engines was fitted in them because the cars weren't that valuable. But Briggs, being, a legendary guy and a very well-educated guy in the car world, knew the importance of the car, and that's why the car was saved, and that's why it survived in his museum untouched for 18 years. And then in 1986, my old mate, me old mucker, Adrian Hamilton, Duncan's son, managed to acquire the car from the Briggs Cunningham Museum, and he flew the car back to the UK, where, in my opinion, it belongs. This car is a national treasure. In order for the car to travel back on the flight, the body was just carefully placed on top of the rolling chassis. The car arrived back in the UK, and then Adrian gave the car to David Cottingham of DK Engineering for a full restoration. And David done a fantastic job, but what they decided to do in that period, which was very common of the period, they decided to just make a whole new body for the car. And that whole new body, the knowledge back then wasn't as good as the knowledge today. And the body that was constructed back then was constructed of the wrong gauge of aluminium. It was a thicker, more production-like specification rather than a lightweight spec car. Following completion of the restoration, Adrian, along with His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent, took this national treasure on the Mille Miglia. What a fantastic few days of driving that must have been for Adrian. And then the car took part in many other Jaguar celebration races over the years. But importantly, the original body survived. The original body wasn't destroyed, wasn't disregarded. Adrian was astute enough to retain the original body and look after the original body. Adrian continued to own the car until about 2009, at which time it was sold to absolutely collector car royalty, Mr. Peter Lavanos. Peter is just a wonderful collector, has been a wonderful collector for decades, and he took the car and decided to do another restoration on it, this time through Gary Pearson. Pearsons are really great Jaguar people, and they done a restoration on the car that was a sympathetic restoration. They decided to restore the original body. But when the car was subsequently sold to its next owner, a gentleman in North America, its most recent owner, who's got a fantastic collection of cars, the advice that he was given at the time from the dealer he purchased the car from was, don't fit the original body on the car. The original body is too fragile and it shouldn't be fitted on the car, and it's so important that it should remain with the car but not fitted on the car. And also, the engine is so important to the car, the original engine. Oh, and the original gearbox is so important to the car that you should preserve those and not fit them in the car. And he invited me to do the Colorado Grand with him in 2019, I think it was. And that was a fantastic experience, something, for me was so special to do the Colorado Grand in the Le Mans winning Jaguar. And whilst doing it, we were chatting. And I said, you're crazy, like why haven't you fitted the original body to this car or have the original engine in it, or the original gearbox? And, he explained the advice that he was given, and I spoke with Chris Keith Lucas, who for me is Mr. Jaguar. He's the most knowledgeable man on Jaguar in the whole world. And I said, Chris, how about we set about doing a real proper refurbishment on this car, but do you think that the original body can be fitted back to it? And we looked at the original body, And he said, absolutely, you know, there's nothing wrong with this. We can fit this original body back on the car. The original engine should be fitted to the car. The original gearbox should be fitted to the car. Following our fun on the Colorado Grand in 2019, the owner made the conscious decision and pulled the trigger in having the car refitted with its original engine, gearbox, and body. All of these items that had been with the car all of its life, but since its restoration in 1986, had never actually all been fitted back on the car. And that work was entrusted to CKL, Chris Keith Lucas, who for me are the absolute best in the Jaguar world. Chris is just such a special guy when it comes to these cars. And we had the privilege of managing that restoration, learning from Chris all the different idiosyncrasies between the lightweight cars and the production cars was fascinating. But the more that we delved into this car, the more special it became. And yes, we know now that the car is refitted with its original body on its original chassis, and it is refitted with its original engine and refitted with its original gearbox. But when we was carrying out the restoration, Chris was blown away by the fact that the brake calipers to the car are actual serial number 2. So these brake calipers are the second set of brake calipers that was ever produced in the world, and they're still fitted to the car today. So throughout the car's life, to give you an idea of how well that the car has always been preserved and cared for, maybe due to the fact of it being in the Briggs Cunningham Museum for all those years, but the same calipers that are on the car today are the same calipers that it won the race with in 1953, and the same calipers that changed car production forever and indirectly saved millions of lives. Following completion of its restoration in 2022, the car was shown at the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, where it was awarded a second place finish in the competition class, coming runner-up to a very special Ferrari 250 GTO that was also freshly restored. We're so privileged and honoured that the owner has chosen us to handle the sale of this car. This has to be in the top 5 of anybody's all-time great cars. And I'm so excited to be handling the sale, and we look forward to selling the car to its next custodian. But most importantly, we really hope you've enjoyed the episode.